Good afternoon. On behalf of the UN Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and the Vienna Energy Forum co-organizers, I'd like to welcome you to our side event today, which focuses on paving the way forward for new solutions. My name is Karina Larson, and I'm with the Climate Technology Center and Network, which is co-hosted by UNIDO and UN Environment, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussions. We will be presenting two panels this afternoon. The first panel will be sharing results and insights from the Vienna Energy Forum, which took place yesterday. This year's forum was specially focused to exploring Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is affordable and clean energy. And the meeting outcomes will contribute to the high-level political forum on this SDG, which will take place in July later this year. The forum yesterday focused on really three critical areas for achievement of SDG 7. Namely, energy system transformation, climate technology and innovation, and the partnerships that are necessary to make the other two happen. Our speakers for the first panel today all have considerable expertise in this area, and I'd like to welcome our first speakers, Sheila Oparaucha, the Executive Director of Energia, the International Network on Gender and Energy, who is serving as the co-facilitator of the technical group of advisors on SDG 7. And I think she'll be joined by her colleague, Mr. Minoru Takada, who is the team leader for sustainable energy with the Division of Sustainable Development Goals at UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. They're going to be speaking on SDG 7 and its review at the UN High-Level Political Forum. Welcome, both of you.
Good afternoon. This is Minoru Takada. I'm from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. My presentation is going to focus on SDG 7. You know very much about SDG 7. But there's going to be the first review, global review of Sustainable Development Goal number 7 this year at the sort of place called UN High-Level Political Forum. This is a gathering of all UN member states to come together to discuss the progress toward all SDGs, look at the challenges, and then think about the way forward. And this year, we got the first time an opportunity to discuss at this intergovernmental level progress toward SDG 7 and how we actually move forward on the SDGs. Now, as a background, you know how difficult sometimes energy discussion can get. You are sitting in Vienna, so you are definitely familiar with this topic called energy very much. At the United Nations, it took 70 years to come to this consensus to have a goal on energy. So this is the first time that you have, in the UN set global goals, a topic on energy. And SDG 7, for that matter, is a very important thing for all the people who work on energy to look at together and push together seriously. Goal 7 consists of 5 targets. 3 of them are very familiar with normally. It is about universal access to electricity and clean cooking solutions. And second, renewable energy, significantly increasing renewable energy. And third, energy efficiency, doubling the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. Those are the sort of 3 main targets. In addition, there are 2 means of implementation targets, which are described a little messy. I'm not going to go through it. Now, international community is going to focus on the progress toward all those 5 targets. High-Level Political Forum is a new forum under the United Nations General Assembly established after 2015 to look at the progress toward SDG. 2016, we started. This year, we did review few goals such as poverty, education, and etc. Last year. And this year, we are going to pick up 6 of the 17 SDGs, one of which is SDG 7. Now, next year, in the 4th year in this cycle, governments are going to take stock of progress across all SDGs, and then they're going to look at to see how we're going to actually improve upon the progress, and also how we improve upon the process of looking at the progress toward SDGs next year. In order for us to be able to bring across the board all technical elements together to support these intergovernmental processes, we at the UN Secretariat convened a group of experts. We are calling them Multi-Stakeholder SDG Technical Advisory Group. There are many of you who joined. I thank particularly UNIDO for their strong leadership on that, but also IEA, ILENA, World Bank, UNDP, you can name them. I have listed about 50 of them here. In fact, about 70 UN and other organizations joined together to bring together their intellectual knowledges. They have produced what we call policy brief. 27 policy briefs were produced to support these intergovernmental processes. Now, they are described around 4 categories. Some of the policy briefs are focused on looking at targets. Some are looking at interlinkages between energy and other issues, such as poverty, inequality, education, water, and etc. We have also looked at in depth regional issues, including some special categories of countries like LDC, landlocked developing countries, and SIDS. And also looking ahead beyond 2030, we looked at several important issues, such as decentralized solutions to cross-border interconnection, and etc. And then all of them culminating together, we have put together what we call Global Agenda for Accelerated SDG 7 Action. This is the one that we are going to promote quite strongly next 2 months, so that high-level political forum will be able to take note of what we have to do under SDG 7. Now, content of that, I'm going to invite co-facilitator of this SDG 7 Technical Advisory Group, Shira, to explain. Shira.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Further to the role I played as the co-chair for the SDG 7 Technical Advisory Group, together with my counterpart Hans Olof from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Norway, I'm pleased to have been invited by UNIDO to present the key message just for policymakers drawn from the 27 policy briefs. The overarching policy message, which has also been reflected in the discussions that we had yesterday as an outcome of the Vienna Energy Forum, is that energy is central both for the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. However, recognizing that there's still major challenges requires that we must step up action. And failure to do so implies that the world will fall short of achievement of SDG 7 and consequently other SDGs. The evidence for this is well articulated in the policy briefs, but also in the Energy Progress Report developed by the 5 SDG 7 custodian agencies that was launched 2 weeks ago in Lisbon. The evidence being 1 billion people currently living without electricity, that close to 40% of the world's population lack access to clean cooking solutions, and are exposed to dangerous levels of air pollution, which results in millions of deaths each year, mostly amongst women and children. That despite the rapid expansion of power generation using renewable energy, little progress has been made in end-use applications, such as in buildings and transport. That the current rate of energy efficiency improvement is not being made fast enough and falls short of the 2.7% per year needed to meet the global target. The financial flows into the energy sector, including for public and private investments, fall short of what is needed. We need to double from US $500 billion per year to over $1 trillion per year. The other reason that we need to scale up action is to capitalize on the transformation of the world's energy system that is already underway and which demonstrates that the SDG 7 is within reach, accelerated by advances in technology, rapid cost declines, and strategic shifts in policy. Trailblazers showcasing this transformation can be seen from among countries with the largest access deficits, such as Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, who from 2010 onwards provided access to at least an additional 3% of their population annually. Or, for example, India, that has provided electricity to 30 million people each year. Capitalizing on this momentum, if we go to the next slide. Capitalizing on this momentum will require strengthened political will, strong leadership, increased levels of investment, bold time-bound actions, and cooperation amongst all stakeholders. To leapfrog the process, a global agenda is proposed to accelerate actions towards SDG 7 in 4 interlinked categories. The first category calls for actions to make clean cooking solutions a top political priority, to close the electricity access gap, to accelerate the pace of transition towards renewable energy, to harness the potential of decentralized renewable energy solutions, scale up investments in energy efficiency across all sectors of the economy, double the finance for SDG 7 globally, scale up capacity building and education, enhance innovation systems, including research, development, deployment, and diffusion, and calls for investments in data collection systems and data analysis. The second category calls for actions to strengthen the interlinkages between SDG 7 and other SDGs in order to harness the potential of cross-sectorial interlinkages to maximize multiple benefits and synergies, giving special attention to poverty reduction, reduction of inequalities, job creation, food security, health, education, clean water and sanitation, transportation, industrialization, innovation, and indeed peace and security. Given the intrinsic links between energy and climate change, the category also calls for actions to promote a unified approach to achieve SDG 7 and meet the goal of the Paris Agreement simultaneously. Because of the disproportionate impact that the lack of clean energy has on women and girls, concerted action is called on to integrate gender equality and women's empowerment in all energy interventions to advance the SDGs. Given the growing trends in urbanization, action is called on to promote sustainable and low-carbon cities and communities with reliable, affordable, and energy-efficient systems. The third category recognizes that a global agenda cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution, and therefore calls on actions to address regional priorities by strengthening inter- and intra-regional cooperation across a number of areas, not least of which to share best practices and lessons. A strong call for action is made to prioritize ending energy poverty in the most vulnerable countries, in particular, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small islands developing states, and countries in situation of conflict or post-conflict. The last category, to accelerate transformation towards a sustainable, inclusive, and equitable energy future, calls for action to promote transformational investments, transform human behavior from energy-intensive lifestyles to more sustainable patterns, strengthen decision-making processes by reinforcing improvements in energy data collection, indicators, and monitoring efforts, and re-emphasizes the needs to harness the power of all stakeholders to drive change. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying that the SDG 7 Technical Advisory Group sincerely hopes that member states and all stakeholders that will gather at the high-level political forum this year in July will find these recommendations useful as they review and renew their commitments to achievements of the SDGs. Thank you.
All right, so on 2018, obviously it's very important, as I hope you understand now, that it took 70 years, so this is the first time that we were able to make really global intergovernmental impact. So I hope that you'll be able to stand up together with us to push that discussion forward. But this year is not the sort of, the final. We have a lot ahead toward 2030. I'll give you a few milestones 2019 in September at the United Nations General Assembly, Secretary General is convening what he calls Finance Summit. As you might remember, in conjunction with SDGs, there was a discussion on financing for development, and it's called Addis Ababa Action Agenda was established in 2015. So this Finance Summit will focus on how to ensure we'll be able to implement the commitment made at Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which will, of course, have an implication on financing for SDGs. Now we are moving to the COP24 in Poland. Beyond that, in 2019, there are two major milestones. High-level political forum will be meeting at the summit level, meaning presidents, heads of states will be meeting together to take stock of all the progress toward SDGs, and also looking at sort of restructuring plan for the high-level political forum. So we'll be able to use this platform in a much better way. And 2019, Secretary General will be also convening SG's Climate Summit. This is where we believe that energy will play a very important role. So we look forward to having your support to make sure these sort of milestones are going to be utilized to push SDG agenda moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minoru and Sheila, for laying out the challenges, the stakeholders that are involved, and also the goals that need to be attained in order to achieve SDG 7, and thus many of the other SDG goals as well. Now I'd like to invite to the stage Mr. Tareq Ahmed, who is the director of UNIDO's Department of Energy. And Tareq is going to be giving you some messages that were gathered at yesterday's Vienna Energy Forum, and also talking a little bit more about how technology and innovation play a role.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome to this afternoon session. And I want to thank the Austrian World Summit organizers for giving us the opportunity to be present with you here today and share some of the ideas and creativity and input that came out of the Vienna Energy Forum yesterday. I want to step back and say the Energy Department of UNIDO, and UNIDO as a specialized agency within the UN system focusing on industry. What is our connection with energy and clean energy transition? We know for a fact that close to nearly 45% of final energy consumption happens in the industrial sector, on industry globally, worldwide. So we could argue that there is a big role on industry to take a leading role in driving the transformation and the change toward a clean energy future by becoming more efficient, by decoupling industrial production from climate emissions. But I think there's another linkage that is important for us and for the message that we hear this morning from Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he said we need a positive message. And when he said also that, if you remember what he said in the morning, that California became the largest state in the US that attracted clean tech investment. 50% of all the clean tech investment was attracted to the state of California. Actually, this is where UNIDO's industrial development role comes in, and that's where the connection to the clean energy transition is most relevant and most important to making an impact on the ground, to making an impact in developing countries. I think, and that's where we have got the confirmation from the conversation yesterday in the Vienna Energy Forum, that if the clean energy transition to make a difference, it really has to create prosperity in least developed economies, in Africa, in Asia, in countries that are also part of the transition. So if we have to make the clean energy transition meaningful, we have to link it with innovation. Innovation that takes place not only in very advanced economies, but that takes place in different parts of the world. So we spent a lot of time discussing this yesterday. We framed our conversation around three kind of key messages in that context. One of them is that the clean energy transition does create opportunities for new industries. The future industries is going to be about clean energy transition. It's going to be the climate-friendly industries, which means that we're going to see new enterprises, new industries, new businesses, new business models. And the call for action from the panelists and from the forum yesterday is we need to support entrepreneurs in developing countries to be part of that industry, to be part of that innovation value chain. That was a very key message that was resonating from the Vienna Energy Forum, and we bring it to the high-level political forum in New York next year. Which means that we have to find ways to support not only entrepreneurs, but the innovation systems around entrepreneurs, to enable a bit young enterprises, startups that are emerging in developing countries to be part of the global markets for the clean energy transitions. We need to open the space for the emergence of new industries, as I said, and facilitate the connection for these enterprises with the global markets. I think that's also the same message around, the key message, again, resonate around how do we support the participation of these enterprises in the clean energy transition. I think one of the key messages that also came from the discussion yesterday in the Vienna Energy Forum is that typically we have talked about North-South cooperation in terms of technology transfer. I think we need to change the language a little bit, and we need to change the way we engage. It's no longer about technology transfer. It's about technology cooperation and knowledge exchange, because that's how we actually support innovation in different places. And part of the conversation is how do we create modalities and joint ventures where entrepreneurs from Morocco join with entrepreneurs from Korea. We talked about it, and how they co-create solutions that are relevant, and then the knowledge is exchanged. So we see a lot of these opportunities, and here we see that is we need to foster these kind of exchanges, and we just not talk anymore about just transferring of machines. We need to transfer knowledge and the systems around them. We have to be also patient and persistent. It's not a hit and run operation, so we have to really, and this is a call for action for all development partners. Building an innovation capacity requires that we take the long breath, that we stay with our partners for long term, for persistence, so that innovation can actually mushroom and flourish. These are some of the key messages that came out of the Vienna Energy Forums. There's a lot more, but I will stop here and leave it to the discussion if we have the time for it. Again, I want to thank you very much for giving us the opportunity and the stage to share some of the findings. And we look forward to the convening in New York in July. Thank you.
Thank you, Tareq. And I think some of those key messages that came out of the meeting yesterday really resonate with those of us in the room who are working on technology transfer and innovation. And the fact is that so often it's not about the hardware, but more about the capacity building, the structure, the policies that enable the use of these new technologies and the growth of innovation. So this is so important. Next, I would like to ask Mr. Karsten Helpop, who's the director of NDEV at GIZ, the German Agency for International Development Cooperation, to join us. Thank you.
System for the slides. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Karina, for this nice introduction. Good afternoon. I thank also the organizers of this event to get the opportunity to present a special topic here on this event, which is dealing with decentralized energy supply, renewable energy supply in rural areas. This work has been prepared not only by Germany, but by a group of different organizations coming from different countries, coming from the south, but also from the north, with some European colleagues. I think it will be shown here on this slide, some of the organizations, and also this topic or this special emphasis on decentralized renewable energy systems is also based on the practical experience of the work of Germany, but also of other countries, and is also the result of joint activities in joint programs, in partnership programs, with the support of other organizations, other countries, Norway, Netherlands, Switzerland, UK, and Sweden. So why are we giving special emphasis to this topic, decentralized renewable energy? I think Sheila already presented this figure of 1 billion people without access to electricity. And if we have a closer look, where do we find these people without access to electricity? We see that 87%, the big majority of these people are living in rural areas. That means if we really want to achieve universal access till 2030, we have to go into the rural areas. There we have the energy poverty. Now, how can we achieve this? It is clear and it's obvious if we look, let's say, at the development in the last 10 years and also a little bit in the future, what is realistic. We must say that we will not achieve universal access in rural areas with grid extension. The growth rates of grid extension into the rural areas are relatively low. The interest to invest into rural areas as utilities is relatively low. So that means the only chance we have to achieve this universal access is using off-grid technologies. And basically, it's solar technologies ranging from simple solar systems, solar home systems, up to mini-grids. What gives us some hope and optimism that we can really achieve this is that we see some positive trends regarding decentralized renewable energy. The first trend is that we have a significant reduction of prices for solar energy in general. It's most visible in the case of the solar panels. So the price was reduced up to a level of 20% compared to former times. But also we see now that also in the battery industry, prices are currently going down. Second important aspect is that the quality of the solar systems has improved over the last 10 years. So maintenance, repair needs are becoming less prominent as in the past. Third element, which is also quite important, is that the appliances, for example, the fan, the refrigerator, the TV, all these appliances which are used based on solar energy, becoming more energy efficient. And that allows us to reduce the system size in the rural areas. Beforehand, we had to really have let's say, a basic energy supply, you needed a 100 or 200 watt panel. Nowadays, you can use a 20 or 30 watt panel, and you can even run your TV with such a kind of system. And finally, also a very positive trend is that we have now new business models in the rural areas based on mobile paying systems, the pay-as-you-go systems where the systems are installed in the households and where people only pay on a monthly basis, more or less the same what they have been paying in the past for scandals or for kerosene. So We have a rapid growth, but we can observe we have a rapid growth of decentralized off-grid renewable energy technologies. And if you look at the statistics of the last years, you can see that the sales of solar home systems have increased tremendously since 2014. And you have a huge number of companies now involved in this business of decentralized renewable energy. So, as I said, there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of opportunities. We have really the chance to achieve universal access by 2060. There are some estimates, what you see here, how it can be achieved, which role would renewable energy play, the mini-grids, the solar home systems. What is also quite positive, and that is new, is that this development of the energy sector is based on a broad spectrum of stakeholders. So it's not only the utility anymore, which in the past was dominating, let's say, the energy system. We have now a multitude of actors, citizens, cooperatives, communities, all kinds of organizations which are involved in this energy system supply. And what is also important, and that was mentioned by Tareq already, this solar system, it's not only, let's say, the target is not only to provide electricity. The target is really to stimulate economic development, productive use of the energy. And with the systems, what we see now is there's a lot of innovations going on, innovations regarding solar mills, regarding solar water pumps. So we see a trend that these kind of activities become more and more important. Nevertheless, we are not, let's say, at a level where we can be satisfied. There are still some big challenges. One big challenge is that, let's say, all this positive trend is still not enough. So there are projections saying that if we continue as we do now with the business as usual, we still will have around 600, 500 million people without access to electricity in 2030. So we have to do more. And there are several barriers which are mentioned here. Some of the barriers are laying in the general investment, climate, or the frame conditions. It's sometimes the question of the tariff setting, which is for mini-grids especially important. Sometimes licensing problems, you have corruption problems, all these kind of things. You have a big problem regarding financing. Find loans, find, let's say, favorable credits for investments into rural areas is still a problem. And we still have a too strong focus from the governments to invest into centralized energy infrastructure, and we think we need a new balance, a stronger shift towards these decentralized energy systems. So based on this, that we cannot be satisfied with the current trend, we have discussed and prepared in this paper a list of policy recommendations, which you see here. I will not go through all of them. I think that will take too much time, but only summarize them. It's basically the question how to create a favorable investment environment, attracting companies, small companies and medium companies, but also motivating local communities, local associations, cooperatives to invest into decentralized renewable energies. And you can, as a government, you can do a lot. You can create these conditions by adapted or appropriate tax regimes, by duties, licensing, what is set here, tariff setting. You can create access to finance, and you can also create all kinds of possibilities to reduce the risk for investors into these decentralized energy systems. Our idea, and that is the final slide in explaining this here, our idea is to go beyond 2030, though not only let's say, look at providing access to people in the rural areas, but to really create and to support a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift is expressed in this title here, Green People's Energy for Africa. So we really think that we have to move away from an energy system which is strongly dominated by the utilities, by a centralized system. We have to shift it to a decentralized system where the regions, the regional governments, the communities, the citizens in the communities play a much stronger role. Because that is a little bit also the experience from Europe, from the past, but also currently, that if we look at the energy transition which is taking place in some of the European countries, we can see that people can be motivated, people in villages, in rural areas can be motivated to invest into energy, in decentralized energy systems, in renewables, putting money together, connecting them with small and medium enterprises in the region, connecting them with financial institutions in the region, and so create, let's say, a critical mass in the region to push these renewable energy systems in the region forward. And that is exactly what we also want to achieve in Africa and in other regions of the South. It's maybe not 100% transferable, the model which has been created in Europe, but we think the principle to strengthen communities, to strengthen regional cooperation on local level, including financial institutions, including communities, small and medium enterprises and citizens, could also be possible in Africa and must be possible in Africa too at the end, and that is where I fully agree with Tareq, to develop rural economies and to avoid that we get an increasing gap between the urban and the rural areas. Thank you very much.
So I think it's clear that energy truly serves not only as a catalyst for economic growth and competitiveness, but is also inextricably linked to attaining the goals of the Paris Agreement and all of the other SDGs, including clean water and sanitation, health, education, food security, and the empowerment of youth and women. I'd like to thank these speakers for their participation in the event, and I'm hoping that we may have time for questions with them after we finish our next panel discussion, so please hold any questions that you may have, but join me in thanking these speakers now. So I'm going to introduce our next panel, and I know that some of you may be interested to stay for this discussion, and to do so. But our next panel is going to delve into the issue of women and youth empowerment a little bit more directly with reference to technology innovation and entrepreneurship that will create more inclusive development. This panel is hosted by the Global Women's Network for Energy Transition, which was founded last year with the aim of empowering women who are working in renewable energy in both developed and developing countries. And it's also hosted by UNIDO and the CTCN. Both of these, the organization and CTCN, which is part of UNIDO, work very much to include gender and youth into our programs, as we know that the projects and the policies that we're developing will be more strengthened and sustainable by including both youth and women in these projects. So we're very happy to have organized this panel today. And to moderate the discussion for us, Ms. Christine Linz, who is the co-founder of the Global Women's Network for Energy Transition, will be joining us. Christine is also the former Executive Secretary of REN 21, which is the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century. And I'd like to ask Christine to join me now, and she'll introduce the rest of our panelists. Please welcome Christine.
Thank you very much, Karina. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to this panel discussion, which will focus on those that will be key agents in making this energy transition happen. We have heard lots of very important information about the policy framework, high-level political forum going to review progress on SDG 7. We know that policy is absolutely key in that area, but we also know that energy transition with renewables and energy efficiency is an energy transition that is relying on people, and it's also contributing to really democratizing the energy sector by enabling consumers to become prosumers and really participate. And this development can be truly sustainable if it encompasses all sectors of society, and we want to shed today a particular focus on the dimension of women and the dimension of youth. We know that women comprise about 50% of the world population, but in the energy sector only about 29% of the workforce. When it comes to renewable energy, the figure quoted from Irina is that there are about 35 women. This shows, ladies and gentlemen, that a large part of this sector is deprived of the creativity and also the sense of innovation of women. And there is some scientific evidence starting that this transition would possibly go quicker if women would play a bigger role. And of course, I think Sheila has alluded to it at her introductory statement. In the developing world, women are the ones suffering most from air pollution through traditional use of biomass and other things. It's also clear that youth, the young people of today, are the decision makers of tomorrow, but they are also the ones that are going to inherit this planet from us. And we have seen today that in the country like Austria, where we have the youngest chancellor in the world, the young people are moving up and participating in decision making. This is going to be the key focus of our panel today. And I'm very happy to introduce the panelists that will join on stage. Sheila and Karsten will stay with us. And I would like to invite them to come to the floor. First, James Elsmore, who is the Director of Solar Heads of State. Then Sasha Gabison, the Executive... Very good. Please take your seat here. Sasha Gabison, the Executive Director, Women Engaged for a Common Future International. If you could just take here. Welcome, Sasha. Next, Rabia Ferruki, the Deputy Director of Knowledge, Policy and Finance Division at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. And last but not least, Atta Das, co-founder of Atomberg Technologies. And I ask you for a round of applause for the entire panel. So you see, I'm joined by a group of very complementary actors in this field. And the way we would like to run this panel right now is to start off with a quick introduction about what each of the panelists is working on, to make sure that this transition is going to be a more inclusive one, including women and youth. And then we're going to have some discussion among ourselves. But I would also like to bring a bit of innovation in the style of these panels and then give the floor to some of you. Should there be questions from the audience, and also should there be questions to either Sheila or Karsten on the previous presentations. So maybe let me start off with you, James. You are Director at Solar Heads of State. Explain us a little bit what this is exactly doing.
Is this... Oh, it's on. That's easy. Hello, as I was introduced, James Elsmore. I direct Solar Head of State, so we're a US registered non-profit, although mostly we work in small island developing states, SIDS countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And the name of that organization comes from our original engagement with these countries, where we would work with the government to install solar on a prominent government building, whether that was the Parliament or the White House equivalent, whatever makes sense, and really work with the government to use that as an opportunity to showcase their wider work. We found that 15 kilowatts of panels on a building like the Parliament got a lot more press attention and public interest than a huge solar farm that might power, a whole city. So that's where the name came from. We've broadened from that work now, and we use each of our projects as a point of engagement focused on youth and communities. So right now we're running a project in Jamaica where we have the Jamaica Solar Challenge. In that project we invited young people to create some kind of communication tool which educated their community on the benefits of renewable energy. And I can talk about that a little bit later. My other hat is here as, I guess, the youngest person on the panel. I'm 25, and I got involved with this panel through my work at Youngo, which is the youth engagement part of the UNFCCC. And so I can also talk a little bit about how that works and how we can engage youth from across the world in the UNFCCC process. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, James. You brought a little movie with you.
I can play the song now if you want to do that.
Sure.
Well, I was told that the technology doesn't work, but what I can try and do is play it through my phone and see if that works. So we can give it a go.
Okay, sure.
So this was actually the...
We're trying innovation here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, exactly. So this was actually the one of the entries to our Jamaica Solar Challenge. And I only got this last week, and I was so happy I almost cried when I got this through. We had so many innovative people sharing this project, so let's see if this works.
Invest in this and we'll be safe. The future, it is what we make. Cut down gas to electricity rates. The solar energy Jamaica, hydroelectric wind energy too. Just listen to the words of the song of Ryan that tell you. Oh yeah, Jamaica light bill too much. We need the renewable energy touch. So we gonna save the country. Make we use renewable energy.
Okay, I had to play that. I'm glad that worked.
You might run out of battery. Renewable energy rocking the world, not only Jamaica. Let me turn to Sasha. Sasha, maybe you can kick us off by explaining a little bit what Women Engage for a Common Future International does and what you see as the main important thing to get women included in this transition.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can see us. We can't see you. You're very far away. I just want to start with a question to you. How many of you have to cook on firewood or on coal, either at home or maybe in your secondary home in the mountains or when you visit your grandmother? Anybody in the room? Nobody. One. Okay, one. Well, I wanted to show you one picture. I'm not sure if we get that if I do like this. Yes. So we heard before from Sheila that 3 billion people still depend on, unsafe fuels for cooking, mostly, but also for heating. And we work as a network. We started in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Caucasus. We now also work in Uganda, Morocco. And everywhere the challenge is similar. Yeah, it's like this: you want to wash your child, but you'll have to heat water first on the stove. You will have to buy lots of firewood before the winter so that you can get through the winter. And it might cost you 30% of your household income if you do that. And often the rooms will be full of smoke. I have a colleague who moved to Georgia, and she lives in the rural areas, and she says it's horrible. I bring my kids to school, and the school classes are full of smoke because the stoves often don't work very well. So this is a challenge for people every day, 3 billion people. And most of them who manage this at home are women. And we might say, well, it's anyway time for women to be, emancipated, and they should start doing something else. So let's ask the husbands to do that. But often there are also no other people around to do that. In Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, many of the men have immigrated, they are working elsewhere, and you have a lot of women and children and older people who are left behind to manage energy at this level. And so I think that is the main reason why we're here. It's very much about how do you then work in these conditions where there's no big companies to help them, where you have a very low income population. And so, of course, the first thing is to look at, well, what do they need and what do they want and what can they already do themselves? And so very much based on low-cost technologies like solar water heaters, but of the simple kind, which cost less than 500 euros to make, or biogas systems where the women can make the forms themselves using their own skills and earning some money, and they're sharing this with each other. And we have many, many other technologies which I could show you, but it's really often the start of work on this area. How do you really get the local communities to take energy management into their own hands and start improving towards cleaner, more renewable sources of energy? And we are very thankful because we have, through, similar to the Youngos, we have the Women and Gender Constituency at the UNFCCC process. And there we share with hundreds of women organizations and gender organizations across the world lessons learned from getting the women to the toolbox and at the same time improving and empowering the situation of women and girls in their countries. And we have started a wonderful cooperation with CTCN on this and UNIDO, where then we have an award and women projects are presented for upscaling, and then the CTCN network, which is hundreds of experts on renewable energy, come and advise, how can they further, improve these self-designed technologies. And I won't go too much into detail because I know I have no time, but I think one of the important lessons, and Karsten also mentioned it, it's not so much only the technologies, it's the business model and the access to finance, and that's often the biggest barrier. Even from some climate funds, we see that once the money gets all the way down to the community level, you might have to pay 28% interest rate in 1 year, and that's often just impossible for investments like this. And so one of the models we have been testing successfully is creating energy cooperatives, gender equitable energy cooperatives, where in the statutes it already says we want women to be entirely, fully part of the decision making, so as board members, as staff, but also as investors, and train them on this. And so far we are at 40%, but we're aiming at 50% in the 5 cooperatives which were created in Georgia. And we have been analyzing also the situation in some of the other countries of Eastern Europe, and now we're starting also in Uganda and in Morocco. But I think many of you will have similar experiences probably, but we need to mobilize this community energy. And if you want the energy fully there, you need to involve men and women and youth. You need all the stakeholders on board. If not, we'll never achieve the Paris Agreement. And it's really a big chance because this way we can really also improve the social equity and equality in the countries. So the combination of all this, we believe, is super important. And so we're very happy to be at this meeting today.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points that you have mentioned in the discussion. Let me now turn to you, Rabia. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, is working on with governments. It's a intergovernmental agency on promoting renewable energy, and of course, data and information is always at the basis of policy making. And IRENA has been really a trendsetter in collecting data about jobs in the renewable energy field. And there, I would also be interested to hear from you whether you have any insights on jobs and women, and share a bit your work with us on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and share with you some of the insights that we have on the what we call the socioeconomic benefits of the energy transition. So very early on, we understood that we need to have, in order to have an energy transition that is inclusive and fair, we absolutely need to understand the linkages between the energy transition and the socioeconomic structures that it's built on. very often in the debates on the energy transition is sort of in isolation of the rest, especially in the energy field. So what we started 5-6 years ago is first look at job creation. What is it that renewable energy can bring in terms of job creation? So we have been able, there was very little out there. Some of it we gather from different institutions, some of it we estimate ourselves. We have what we call employment factors in order to try to determine how much a renewable energy technology can bring in terms of job creation. Of course, it's not a panacea, but it is quite relevant in terms of a new sector, for example, that can generate more jobs. But then we also understood that having those numbers, we have to go a bit further. Our member states, we have close to universal membership at IRENA, wanted to know what is it along the segments of the value chains, what kind of jobs do I need, how many, but also what kinds, and which ones can I localize? So we started looking at different technologies. We have now looked at PV, wind offshore, wind onshore. We're looking at solar water heaters now, and to see exactly, for example, for a 50 megawatt PV plant, how many jobs do you need along all the segments of the value chain? And what kind of jobs? Are there all skilled jobs? Are there jobs that necessarily require a STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics background? So all of this knowledge is is instrumental in trying to inform policymakers on skills, education policies, labor market policies, etc. So that's on the modern side, I would say, of the renewable energy sector. But then in the access context, we also started a few years ago looking at what kind of jobs do we find in the access context. And their data is even more difficult to find. So we had to rely on anecdotal evidence, on case studies, etc., to gather some sort of storyline about jobs. And there we found that what is extremely important is to have a sort of inclusive innovation approach. And we have found that many social enterprises are increasingly looking at this approach in order to see what kind of jobs can bring productive uses, etc. And I'll go into that a bit later on. I'd like to just add one more point on the energy transition, which is looking at modern versus access context. You clearly see that there is no one energy transition. There are many energy transitions, and with different solutions to each one of them, even if, of course, the linkages that we find do go to the different SDGs that we are trying to achieve in both contexts. So I think that's very important, and when we measure the future of the energy transition in our work at IRENA, we clearly show that this is about the modern context. There is great potential with achieving huge potential in terms of jobs, in terms of GDP, in terms of employment, in terms, of welfare. But in order to do so, we really have to look at energy policy, that energy policy is not just policy about energy, but that goes beyond in order to bring a cohesive sort of policies, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about policy later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabia. You mentioned that there is not one transition, but many transitions. We must not forget either that SDG 7 does not only have one goal, but it's about sustainable energy for all, significantly increasing renewable energy and energy efficiency. And with this, I would like to turn to Shiba Brata Das, who is a co-founder of Atomberg Technologies, a young entrepreneur working in the energy efficiency field. So tell us a little bit about what you are doing and how you contribute to this energy transition from your perspective, please.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. So we design and develop smart and energy efficient home appliances. For example, one of our products is India's most energy efficient ceiling fan that consumes 65% less electricity. Now imagine in India, there are more than 240 million fans are being already installed and running. And they are consuming almost 100 wattage, right? And if you just replace 10% of them with our own innovative energy efficient product, you can just imagine the impact that it can bring into table, right? So all these 240 million fans collectively probably consume more than 45,000 gigawatt hour of energy. One more interesting thing that we do is that along with just providing an energy efficient product, we also believe in practicing various sustainable and practices. So what we do, for example, in our company, we have more than 150 employees. And we have made a policy that 50% of our assembly workers has to be women. And we are trying to implement a lot of other practices which are surrounding sustainable and inclusive development. So what my strong belief is that we as an organization first have to believe in the core idea of sustainable development, and then we'll have to practice all these things, first within our organization, and then probably we can just talk to other organizations about the same. Yeah. This is about us, and probably then we'll talk more about as we go.
Thank you very much. I would like to start this conversation by starting to focus on the aspect of regulation and policy. As very often, we refer to the need for having an enabling environment to really make this energy transition happen and also to make it inclusive. So my question to the panel, whoever would like to answer, is what regulation policies have proven successful to break gender stereotypes and empower women, or also then empower youth in that sector? Anybody would like to start? Yes, please.
I think that involving civil society, this might be a slight tangent from your question, but the civil society is the best way of involving youth.
And why?
And the reason for that is that the civil society plays a vital role in holding governments to accountable, particularly in the energy and environment space. What we found is, particularly in small island developing states, you often have an energy ministry that might be a handful of people. And because of the way that the global environment system works, half the team is probably at some conference or some event all the time, which is just the reality of working in a small environment. You have a really limited capacity. So having some kind of civil society groups such as environmental activism or youth environment groups are really vital there to help hold the governments accountable. One issue with energy is that it's a bit scary. People find it a bit difficult and intimidating to embrace it because of the technical aspects of it. So, that's why I think plastic bag bans have started to spread throughout the SIDS. There's something that's kind of easily tangible, easily understandable, and people can grasp that. If you start talking about grid interconnection, kilowatt hours, and all those things. I work in energy. I don't have a technical background, and sometimes I feel like I've got to be careful to make sure I say the right thing. So an issue there, I think, is trying to involve young people when energy does feel so complex and making it simple. And as for policies that have actually helped doing that, I'm not sure whether it is something that government policy can directly tackle, but making funding available for local grassroots organization, I think, is key. Because often this funding is available on the international level, and as I said before, I think the resources available at the government and international level for SIDS countries is pretty saturated, but very little of that is available for a grassroots organization. So often the grassroots organization might be run by people who are full-time teachers. Teachers don't have enough time to run an organization. But there's no resources there to pay salaries or give training. So that's something that I would like to see more of, is resources and empowerment from the international community that go down to that grassroots level, and to increase that interaction between civil society and government.
Okay, so policy to empower grassroots, NGOs. Yes, please, Sasha. And then Rabia, and Sheila wants to come in.
I think it's an important point. It's of course already great that we have a gender policy for the Green Climate Fund, and that we now, since the beginning of this year, also have a gender action plan of the UNFCCC framework as a whole, which now needs to be applied to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Rulebook. And that's still a lot of questions. How do you do that? And what does it mean when you get all the way down to the local level? And I think there's still a lot we can share from our lessons learned here of the people on the podium. There's a lot of capacity building to do. 34% of the NDCs, which are the national climate strategies, mention gender in some form. But often it is about simple things, like making sure that you set some targets for making funding accessible to local level, to include women and feminist organizations in the capacity building measures, to create maybe even specific windows of financing for local women organizations to support the implementation at the local level. Because often we see that it's not so easy if you want to have women as a specific target group. It's not so easy to do it without the support of the women and gender organizations. They're a really important stakeholder, but often they're forgotten. They're not being involved in planning of a national climate strategy. But many of us, I think, have started to do that. I know Energia, Sheila is doing that. We are doing that with our partners. And I think that these lessons we're happy to share. And I know that this is also happening already a little bit at the regional meetings of the Green Climate Fund, of the CTCN meetings, but much more can be done in that area. And then at the local level, we really need to look at the legislation. What are we still subsidizing in fossil fuels? How does it make renewable and safer energies more difficult to compete on the local level? It's really a problem. I mean, firewood gets subsidized partly, yeah? And it's unsustainable firewood often. Charcoal, it's a big, criminal business as well. So how do you make sure that you sort of, on the one hand, support these upcoming markets, and on the other hand, also reduce the subsidies which are going to these areas? And finally, you really need to support your civil society organizations and the sustainable social enterprise, legislation. So not each country makes it easy to set up, for example, a community-run energy cooperative. And that's already a first area where you can start.
Thank you. So, given where we are,
Go ahead, Sheila.
Given where we are, and this is a session that's being convened by the UN, I think we won't do justice if we don't mention the Beijing Platform for Action, which really was the entry point for setting up a strategy, the gender mainstreaming strategy, that leveraged commitments from governments, from member states of the UN, to integrate gender in all your policy programs and budgets. I think that's one. Secondly, we do have the SDG 5, which is very closely linked to SDG 7, which calls for gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. And that, I think, is really going to be, there was a lot of, even when in 2015, there was a recognition from the international community and member states that this was really an enabler for all the other SDGs. At the regional level, we're also beginning to see some best practices particularly from the ECOWAS region. ICRI, one of the regional secretariats on energy efficiency and renewable energy, has really paved the way in how regional bodies and regional policies can be a springboard for setting up regional policies that countries can use to translate actions at the national level. And then when we come to and of course in other countries you do have similar policies. When you come to the country level, the global line, the efforts that have been made over the past few years, and here I think it's important I would mention one of the champions, which is the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, that has worked with governments on setting up action plans and on policies on cooking energy, has been a game changer. A lot of the countries very much were focused on electrification, and now we also have home cooking energy, and we know that cooking energy is very important for women, so I think that's one. Others is that we're beginning to see in, for instance, in procurement policies within utilities, that they're beginning to set targets for including women businesses as part of your PPP. So I think these type of regulations, and certainly not to forget decentralized, where we see that I think the ARENA study showed that when we have renewable energy, that seems to be an entryway for actually including women in energy value chains and supply chains. Energia, we're working with close to 8,000 individual women entrepreneurs, and we have found mainly in renewable energy value chains, in solar and in clean cooking, And we've found that where policies and regulations have to allow, first of all, private sector investment, but secondly, to allow local businesses to engage in the renewable energy sector, you find this also seems to be a pathway for including women.
Thank you. Rabia, any lessons you want to share from your policy work?
Yeah, so I'm a great believer in an intervention, whether it's targets, quotas, whatever, in order to promote this issue of gender and gender empowerment. And the reason being that I saw through the work that we do on jobs and the future of jobs along the value chains of renewable energy technologies. I mean, we basically need to inform policymakers in order for them to establish education policies, labor policies, etc. And in doing so, there is a great opportunity because it's a more multidisciplinary field, and it seems to be attracting more women. So the information and raising awareness on this has to be done, but also we need to try to incentivize women to go into certain fields, and for that, education policies is extremely important. But beyond that, important is the fact that it is really you need to incentivize women engagement even in policy design. We have done a study which we're finalizing now with two academics, two ladies from South Africa, who went through 6 or 7 sub-Saharan African countries to try to see what is the impact of IPPs, large-scale wind, solar projects on the communities, whether there are community benefits. And interestingly enough, those that have had an impact are those that have policy scorecards that incentivize, introducing gender training, or where you need to, for example, we have an example of an IPP where training was a condition by the community, where women usually when you don't have this kind of scorecards like they have in South Africa, usually women have the lower paid jobs and they don't necessarily get benefits from the projects. So all of that is to show that these projects themselves, even if it's large-scale projects, can bring benefits, but you need to sort of negotiate that from the beginning. One of the very important aspects that we look we have shown in this, that is illustrated in this project, is that if communities do not, from the beginning, on the onset of the project, negotiate with the project developer land arrangements, they don't necessarily benefit from the projects. But if they do from the beginning, then there's great benefits that can accrue to the community in general and to women specifically. So maybe I'll leave the floor to others, and I would like later on to come on the finance aspect.
We're going to tackle we can actually tackle that in the next round. Yes, Karsten, you want to come in as well on policy specifically?
Yes. I would maybe add some critical remarks in this respect, because I think we have to be careful not to come too much with general recommendations. Quite often, the critical things are really laying in the details. I want to give you 3 examples. In my presentation, I was very much supporting the new technologies, the solar systems, the solar lanterns. But it has, if you look at the gender aspect, it has also a downside, because the electricity sector is dominated by men. But if you look who is selling the kerosene, who is selling the candles, these are the small shops, the small retailers in the villages, and that quite often are women. So we will have a negative effect by pushing a lot the electricity. So we have to take this into account when we have really to look very much in the detail. If you look at the cooking sector, well, the mud stoves are quite often produced by the women, because the pottery is a very strong women-dominated sector. If we go into the direction of metal stoves, we have a completely new situation. Then the metal, the blacksmiths, whitesmiths, that is a sector dominated by men. So if we push towards this kind of new technologies where we say, well, that's a big step forward, it also has a downside on the gender, and that is something as I said, we have to take into account. We maybe will also talk about financing. Also, I have read, I was not involved in these kind of studies, but that, for example, some microfinance institutes are providing loans only to women because they were saying, well, they are more reliable. The payback rate is much higher than in the case of men. So based on this policy, the husbands were saying, look, I need a loan. So they take the women just in the forefront to ask for the financial support, but in reality, it's the man who is behind it. So these are, let's say, makes the things a little bit more complicated, and we have to be really, that's my message, we have really to look in the details and maybe correct and specify once in a while our recommendations. So we need a combination of a very detailed monitoring and analysis combined with very specific, very targeted policy recommendations.
Can I just come in here? But so maybe I guess it's supposed to be a discussion and a dialogue. Karsten, I maybe not understood all the points that you raised, and yeah, forgive me if I didn't. But I think one key issue, I did my postgraduate degrees in gender and development, so sorry if I become a bit theoretical. But one of the issues when we're trying to look at gender transformation is not only to focus in the areas and the sectors where women are engaged, but also to look in the areas where they're not engaged and where we find that's where the money is being made and that's where the value addition. And the cooking energy, I like that you mentioned the cooking energy because that's one area that we work, where indeed, when you look at the value chain, you talked about mud stoves or even the ceramic stoves, that women are very much involved in the molding and the claying, but when it comes to the cladding and the metal, that's very much a male business. And when you look at where the money, when you follow the money, you find that where a lot of money is being made is certainly in the metal cladding. So when we first started working with our partners, said, no, it's too difficult for women. This is a difficult job, hitting the metal, etc. It's too difficult for women to work in this area. So this is why we're not finding women there. And we challenged and said, listen, let's see. Let's not just take it for granted, but let's see if women are actually going to enter into that sector. It doesn't only be that they have to do the cladding, but they can be employing and running those industries. And so that what we found that worked is identifying what are the bottlenecks for women's engagement in that, what are the opportunities for doing. Is it the technical training for doing the cladding? Is it having a more safe environment? Is it just changing the mindsets and the attitudes? And using your interventions to try and integrate women into those sectors. Maybe that's not what you were saying at all, but I did want to clarify that we should not just focus on the clay stoves and say women are going to be involved only in clay stoves. Yes, the metal stoves, even though we find women very much in the lower value chains, they should also be, we also want to see women technicians and, in other areas. That's
Karsten, you want to? Yeah, sure, absolutely. We're here to have a debate.
Okay, yeah. No, I agree. I agree with you that, of course, if it's not our intention to recommend to save the kerosene sales and the candle sales. The only thing what I'm saying is if you push the energy sector in a certain direction, that you have to be clear about the consequences, and that these consequences, even if the intention is positive and shared by all, because we all say renewables is important, solar is important, that should be pushed, that we also see, let's say, the downsides and have to do something. So we have to do something also to balance this, and the losses which make these kind of women make, we have to compensate it. That is one story. The other aspect is, if you look at what you mentioned about the cooking, we in our program, we do the same what you are suggesting. We are supporting that women are trained in workshops in these metal technologies. But we are realistic. We see that this is a long process. So we will not come close to a situation where we have, let's say, a 50-50 share between women and men in this business. We will have individual cases, or we will have some few women being trained, being active in this sector, but it will take 10 years, it may take 20 years if you really have a fundamental change in this sector. That is where we have to be clear. So we have to decide, take a decision in the sense, nevertheless, we think metal stoves are better, so we go ahead. But we could also say, one chance would be, we say, we help women to, which are already very strong, what you said, in the mud or a ceramic business, we help them to make their products better, compatible, even with metal stoves. That could be one strategy. I'm not saying we have to analyze it. Second is if we say, no chance, they will not be able to compete, then we have to take care that they do something else, that they have a chance to get their earning, and that's it.
Thank you. Let me move to the next topic. I think many of you were quite keen on talking about money. And so I would like to come to the finance aspect. And I just wonder whether there is any experience on the panel of financing schemes or business models that particularly facilitate or support the inclusion of women and youth. Yes?
Yeah, I think one of the things we have seen work quite well is to look at where are the women already making money and how can you help with new energy technologies in that value chain so that they can earn better money, that there is also a better way for them to pay back their investments. So there are really nice examples of the women who have shellfish in Senegal, and then they work on that with fire stoves, but you can also do it with solar solutions. And it costs them less money, and they can then invest the money which they save into further, increasing their sales or marketing or whatever. So it's an interesting way to link it to their existing value chains, and often that's in agriculture, but not always. And I think one of the things is we also don't build our own boilers at home. We also have companies who do that for us, but we can be part of such a company. We can really stimulate women to be trained to be part of companies, and they can be, business people, salespeople, etc. And I think that is also the interesting part for us when it comes to financing. We see that it's, of course, always more difficult as an individual household or individual person to try and get a loan from a bank, especially if you have no bank account, no land ownership, which is often the case. And so you really need to find these other ways of getting women, entrepreneurs, access to these funds. And I think by organizing as enterprises, as cooperatives, you have two things. You can access better levels of interest rates, and you can also access risk reduction funds. So you can have like micro insurances or so. And I think that market of the micro credits and the micro insurances is very interesting, but currently it is still very expensive once it gets all the way to the local level in the villages. And there we need to do much better. And there I think climate funds really need to make the difference. And currently we still see that we add subsidies to climate funds, they go to a country, and these conditionalities, these favorable conditionalities are hanging somewhere in the middle, in small banks, in towns, but they don't come all the way down to the beneficiaries. And I would like to know also from the panelists, what can we do to really get access to finance at 2% or at 3% and not at 28% for the final beneficiaries? Thank you.
So I fully agree with Sasha. We definitely need more community-oriented structure of projects and financing to better have an inclusive system. And the reason I'm saying that is because everybody talks about the great at the local level, local entrepreneurships and the solutions that we have found. But if we look at investment in the off-grid sector today, for instance, $500 million have been raised over the past 2 years, but 56% of those funds are with 4 companies: MCOPA, OGE, Mobisol, and Lumos Global. The top 10 have about 87%. So, I mean, we have to really find solutions so that we don't have this concentration of financing, first of all, but also one that is more gender sensitive, because as we know, and this is true overall in the modern sector as well, but certainly women in rural areas, they lack definitely the access, as you just mentioned, the possibility to raise finance, and this is why I was speaking earlier on land ownership, and here land ownership patterns and inheritance laws are what they are, and they just prevent access to market, to credits, to financial services, etc. So there's some nice examples. I'm sure you know many more than us, but there is this, maybe you can speak about it, Sheila. I think Energia was part of this Manzingira Safi initiative, which is the women-led briquette making business in Kenya, which initially couldn't find any funding, and then finally through crowdfunding found project, and there are other examples of that. So I think definitely we have to try to find more solutions of the kind in order to get gender-sensitive financing and community-based.
Thank you. Anybody else wanting to come in on how to bring the costs down for these small-scale projects? Sheila? I think a lot has already been said, particularly by Sasha. I always say that the best kept secret by women is the women's savings and credits groups. That women are able to organize and mobilize themselves so that they can save amongst themselves. And in countries like Kenya, this is a billion-dollar business. It's not just small money. And by using this, they are able to provide startup capital, but also able to, in some ways, like in the Energia project, we have used it, we have managed to leverage it, also with our own funding, but certainly with the funding from the women's groups, to leverage it to mitigate risks from financial institutions to bring down the interest rate. So I think that is one. But I think just generally, what we see is just having funds. So, for instance, the EU had a call for financing for women organizations. The Africa Development Bank has that. So having specific funds that recognize the challenges, the structural barriers and challenges that women face to access capital, and having funds that take that into consideration in the way they are operationalized and rolled out, I think can really be very helpful, and that usually comes from the public sector as well.
Let me turn to you. Did you face any challenge in raising capital for your business? Was that difficult?
Oh yes, that's a very golden challenge. So absolutely yes, we do face a lot of challenges in raising funds, right? For example, we have been trying to raise $5 million for last 7-8 months, but still we're struggling. The problem is that, for example, we at developing countries like India and Asia, we have a lot of innovative technology, like these products and solutions. But the financing ecosystem is much, much poorer than the western part of the country. And when I talk to multiple investors here, they are not willing to go and risk their capital in those countries. And these are major challenges that we face. So they ask us to, come to and shift to Europe. But that doesn't solve the solution, right? So that's definitely a huge challenge for us to raise funds.
I just also wanted to mention that what was mentioned earlier, you have already systems which work quite well, like pay-as-you-go. I think Karsten mentioned it. It's very interesting because it allows two things. It allows, first of all, that if you don't pay back your installment, the solar lamp goes back to the company. And you can turn off the solar lamp at a distance, which is a distance system, so it just stops working. But it also allows you to sort of communicate with your client, and when there has been a bad harvest, then make sure, okay, you pay only in the time when there's harvest income and not during the other months, so you can have much more flexible ways of paying back interests on or loans on investments in renewable energy. And what we are also looking at is how can you apply the same system which also work for people who buy mobile phones. I mean, the mobile phone market is, going everywhere, even in the most rural areas. And one of them is indeed this purchase and lease. So even in our cooperatives, households can invest in a solar water heater, and the property remains with the cooperative until they have completely paid back the loan. And if they don't pay back the loan, the solar water heater can be taken away from the house. It's a bit more complicated than taking back a phone or a television, but it is also possible. And I think it's very important that you have financial mechanisms which are really adapted to the situation of your clients. And if they have only seasonal income, for example, then you have to build around that, that payments are not going to be monthly, but only at certain times of the year or so. So that type of flexibility really needs to build into your systems.
Just another thing, Christine, is that we're beginning to see another model is impact investors. So for instance, Calvert Foundation, Acumen are coming into the space where they're supporting women businesses and not necessarily wanting to see an economic return on investment, but rather seeing the return on investment in terms of the impact and what the impacts could be, the economic empowerment of women that they see. Yeah, so that's also another instrument that is becoming quite excited and is being used.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to look at you because there is actually quite a lot of light preventing me from seeing you, but we'll manage. Are there any questions to either of the panelists from the floor? If yes, please raise your hand. My colleague Joy has a microphone there, and she would come to you. If this is not yet the case, I will give you some more time to think about any questions you might have. And is there one? No. No. I think people are a bit shy still, or they digest a very good lunch. I will continue that discussion here. Many of you are actually involved in implementing concrete projects on the ground, and I would like to hear from you about some of the challenges, but also the mistakes that you encountered, because I think those will help us to just learn from them and make it better in the future. Mistakes or challenges when it comes to inclusion of youth or women in energy transition projects. Any experiences to share? Whoever wants to go first.
I'll go. Well, I'm the only panelist, I think, focused on the youth engagement, so I'll talk about that, and then we can go back to the genocide. I think one key thing on the international level projects, for example, with Youngo or these various other projects that try and bring youth from around the world together to work on climate change engagement and things like that, is just a lack of consideration of the needs of youth from the global south for very basic things like visas, for example. I saw one amazing project, which was a great opportunity, that was bringing youth from SIDS countries together. I won't say which the name of the project was, but and involved a trip to the UK, the Schengen area, Canada, and the US, which is a great opportunity, but that's 4 visas for many people. So what you saw with a project like that was that there was a very small group of people that either had access to an Australian or New Zealand passport or something like that, or had previously been to those countries that were able to apply for those visas, and really limited the engagement of which type of youth were able to go. Not saying that those people shouldn't be able to apply, but trying to make those experiences available for everyone would be fantastic. For example, making sure there's enough lead time for people to be able to apply for those visas, and also supporting the costs of applying to those visas, which can be very, very time-consuming. On the ground, in terms of local engagement projects, It might be an obvious answer, but just a lack of local leadership from projects. I mean, clearly I'm a British guy working in the Caribbean, and there's a lot of complications that come with that. There's not really my role to be leading everything on the project. I try and help act as a funnel to bring the money from the US or Europe to run a project, but making sure that we have local people trying to, the competition that I mentioned, for example, engaging and going out to schools and doing the outreach for those is really important, and being able to get that dynamic.
Let me also ask you the question. You mentioned that you are participating in representing youth at the UNFCCC process. Do you feel that the voice of youth is heard in that international processes?
That's a difficult one. I mean, the token is definitely there, that these youth representatives are made at different levels, and there is the opportunity to speak. I think Youngo is a good organization in that it helps kind of build capacity and involve youth from that sense, and just give that access point. Whether the voice is always heard, I'm not sure. That's a bit of a difficult one.
But what would you need to be empowered to create more impact?
Can you come back to me on that one?
Okay.
That's a difficult one.
Absolutely. We will let the audience pause, and then you pause as well. Yes, Karsten.
If there's no question, I would mention two very typical challenges in our practical work, referring to youth and to gender. In the case of youth, in my presentation, I was emphasizing that we have really to go into the rural areas, because there we have the big problems. And that, of course, the youth is playing a key role by providing capacity development, to create the necessary skills to start business, etc. One big problem we are facing is that, of course, when young people are trained well and have the necessary skill, they migrate to the cities. So at the end, we have difficulty to keep them or to motivate them to stay in the village. In the case of women, it's a little bit different. They are quite often staying. So the men are migrating, and the youth is migrating. But as I said, we want to support the youth to develop the skills, but that is a challenge where we still have no real solution. Regarding women, we are also quite active in providing electrification, solar system for schools, for health centers, and specifically for health centers. Let's say the typical very positive effect you have is that women which are pregnant develop more confidence to go to the health center, because the delivery is done under light and under much better condition, much better hygienic conditions, as if you have the health center in the dark. The big challenge we face is to maintain, to make this system sustainable. You can go through all the different countries, and you will see that a large percentage of these centers which have been electrified 5, 6, 7 years ago, a relatively large percentage are not operational anymore, or not as operational as they should do. And that is a big problem, because all these health center schools, they say, well, we don't have the financial resources to do to maintain them, to repair them. Sometimes you have a too centralized system where, let's say, the ministry in the capital is distributing the money to the last remotest health center, and that long distance is not working well. So the big benefit for the women, for the family, for the household is lost after 5 years. And again, we are testing all kinds of solutions, of all kinds of ideas, but we haven't found, let's say, the ideal solution.
James, you were going to come
back? I've had time to think now.
Yeah, I think...
So I do think the UNFCCC process has a really good youth engagement program, and that works really well, including other organizations that kind of spin out of the UNFCCC, like CTCN. There've been talks about whether youth involvement in that can be more formalized, but I was a delegate to a CTCN meeting as kind of an informal observer to represent youth at those meetings. I wanted to mention that the one delegation that I was involved with, which was from the Seychelles, I thought the Seychelles did a really good model of trying to engage their own youth and kind of give capacity. So they brought about 6 Seychelles young people to the last COP in Germany, and they also had about 8 youth from mostly Europe and North America and some other countries. And that was a really good partnership because a lot of the youth from Europe had the chance to go to maybe 2, 3, 4 COPs, and anyone who's been to a COP knows how overwhelming it can be at first to try and get involved with that. And the Seychelles youth, that was their first time, and so pairing them and obviously using the Seychelles access to badges, pairing the local youth and international participants together to give that experience, I think worked really well, and that was a good way of involving everyone. Obviously, one issue with the UNFCCC is that the last 3 COPs have either been in Europe or very close to Europe, and the upcoming one is in Poland, so that does limit the opportunities for other people, and the question there is always going to be what funding is available for people to participate in these processes. I was lucky with the CTCN meeting that I was actually already in Copenhagen for something else and was able to attend. And even then I'm from the UK, so it's not too hard, but it's a different matter if you're coming from Southeast Asia or South America or somewhere else. There's a lot of costs involved.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, just adding to the point that they have mentioned, see, I think one mistake that we do in engaging youth is that we do not understand their priorities. This is across globes, across generation, across ages, it varies. People do have different priorities. I mean, I have different priorities than you. I am looking for more growth, then probably you are looking for more stability. So this is within an organization when we interact. And challenges are very local. We cannot have a single policy for the entire nation. We'll have to have multiple local policies. For example, one of the major challenges that we are facing in a rural area is that we are distributing our product there, and we are trying to engage a young woman for distributing the products. The problem that we face is that in rural area, in that particular village, woman doesn't want to work. It is against their fame, or they are proud, right? So they are we're involving with the local, local male people, and trying to just influence them that it is good for the entire families and all. So we face different challenges at different local levels. For example, in our organization only, out of 50, out of 50 women that we have in our company, 20% of them recently left in last 6-7 months. And the reason behind them is that they are now getting married and they're shifting to a different place. But then our entire cost just got stuck, right? So there are multiple challenges, I think, for both women and as well as youth engagement. But we need to understand their priorities. We need to understand what they're looking for. And accordingly, we'll have to make a lot of local policies and not a national level or a global policies.
Thank you. Rabia?
Yeah, just maybe an interesting finding that we have from, we have a project facility, the IRENA ADFD is Abu Dhabi Fund for Development that provides funding, co-funding for certain projects below a certain size, a few millions actually, per year. And one of the interesting findings is once we have introduced through the project design phase gender-sensitive questions, and of course both male and female participate to the process, but giving a sort of equitable voices to both men and women, we find that that the priority given out of the benefits of the project prioritized education and access to water and electricity for the community over monetary compensation when we didn't have both voices speaking. So I think that's another interesting finding in terms of project design and how you can basically show that by having a more diverse group, you can outperform basically a homogeneous group.
Sasha?
Yeah, I wanted to share two things. One is indeed that when you work in rural areas and you work with more remote areas, often it's a problem for women to travel to another place to come and be trained. Yeah? And so already if you want to start with technology transfer or business trainings, you have to go to them. And we had a wonderful project proposal which wasn't funded by the European Commission. If anybody here wants to fund it, please come and see me afterwards. But it was to go with this mobile school with lots of different technologies, and it's already happening in some countries. But this was specifically for West Africa. And go to the villages, and you know that this would be a very efficient way to really get and work locally and make sure that the women can participate. Often they cannot participate if you are doing it outside of the villages. And then what we then had to do is to organize groups, entire buses, get all the women in it, and make sure that you have childcare, etc., etc. So you need to sort of plan with that type of constraints. So I thought that was important to share. And I think I wanted to mention also another issue, and that is of sexual harassment. And I think that is an additional barrier in many, not just in the difficulty of going from one place to another, and that it's maybe not safe to take public transport, but we need to plan with this and how to eliminate this at all levels, and understand that it's often an unseen barrier, yeah? Even to work together with in gender equitable energy cooperatives. You really have to make it a policy that there is zero tolerance for sexual harassment, that you have very strong policies against it, because if not, it's often preferred that it's a women-only cooperative. And in a way it is a pity, because you would want to have gender equitable enterprises where both men and women are
exactly, because in this empowerment, and this I think is really key. It's not only about the women, it's about both men and women. And we need the men in this making this transition equitable as much as we need the women. And I think that's a very important point, that this issue, and that's why I'm very happy to see many men in the audience. You are our champions to push this aspect further.
Yeah, just an anecdote. The reason why I mentioned this study that we're doing on IPPs and what the IPPs brings to the community, and actually this is an idea we had a few years ago thanks to REN 21's CIREC, where I was on a panel when we were speaking about the benefits from renewable energy, and one project developer said, well, I'm developing a project, and one of the issues that we have is that when we come to poor communities, prostitution increases. So that's the reason why we wanted to see what happens when projects come to the ground and how they can help or destroy certain communities. So yeah, I agree with you. And that is in certain poor communities, but of course we know it's true also in the modern sector, where we have also issues of sexual harassment.
So just to build on the very good interventions that were made by the other panelists, in terms of the trainings, which is true, it's not just women are not mobile, but they've got many different tasks that they do. But one intervention we have found has worked is to move from the classroom type of trainings to the mentorships. So the one-to-one mentorships that you can provide to the women entrepreneurs. But another thing is also, with entrepreneurship, it means you have to look for markets. And first, what they'll do is the first market is your family, then it's your neighbors, it's your extended family, it's your community, but after that, your market is saturated. And you have to move to the next village or to the next area. Mobility for women, access to expert to transport and the social culture barriers for women to move from your home to another place, we found has been maybe even a greater barrier than the financing. Because financing, at least we can mitigate. So that's something. And usually in our interventions, we don't take into consideration women's transportation or breaking those barriers. In Indonesia, in our program, we found, in our program that we're running, we found that there was a significant difference in terms of a woman's business to grow as to whether she was allowed to own and to use a motorbike or not. And it goes, first of all, from the bicycle to the motorbike to etc. And you can really see the difference in cultures that do allow women to be mobile, or women have access to this type of mobility or not. But you cannot run a business if you cannot be mobile and transport. And that's particularly in rural areas. Another thing is the definition of women's businesses as informal sector, which I think is really, certainly from the ILO, we know that 80% of women are in the formal sector. But that then has, in a lot of countries, being formal means you're registered with the Chamber of Commerce. And everything else that is not, which is the majority of women businesses, is informal. Yet you're still paying local rates to local authorities. If you have a market stall, you're still paying that. But that then has an impact on where you can access your financing, where you can access services. So I always have, we also, I think, working with local governments and raising awareness of local governments on this informality, I think, is another critical area. Agency. If you're an entrepreneur, at first we thought everybody was an entrepreneur. Then we realized that not everybody is an entrepreneur, and it really takes, for you to stand up and be able to sell in a market and say, come you buy my goods, amongst everything, takes a lot of assertiveness. And a lot of the way that we're brought up doesn't necessarily instill that type of assertiveness. So apart from giving the business and the technical training to our women, we have actually included a training on agency and empowerment to build that confidence and build that leadership that, yes, I can do that. And in actual fact, we found that this has been an instrument that they use in the private sector. A lot of training is given on assertiveness, leadership, your confidence, etc. So using that also for women entrepreneurs.
I'm very glad that you also bring in the aspect of mentoring. The Global Women's Network, we've just launched the first global mentoring program on which some people on the panel here participate as mentors, where we really believe in this empowering women, be it as entrepreneurs or be it in the energy sector, to really step up in their career and to really go a mile further. Are there, in the meantime, any questions from the floor? This is your last chance to get yourself heard, to make a comment, to criticize, to ask a question to the very illustrious panel, maybe ask also some questions related to the first session that we had, where you heard a bit about the main conclusions of the Vienna Energy Forum, and also some programs that are in the pipeline, like Green People's Energy for Africa. No questions from the floor? Okay, that is surprising, but that seems to be the case.
So, do you mind if I'm just a little bit provocative?
Sure.
And I don't mind to put Karsten on the spot here, but we've known each other for a long time. But we're here in the audience, and I see the Honorable Minister from Uganda for Energy has left, but I'm sure we have a lot of partners from governments, but from other areas. But Karsten mentioned that we talked about metal cladding, and that he said it would take about 10 years. You said it's taking a long time, and about almost 10 years, to really have this shift and changing. Do you think it's acceptable that it will take 10 years for women to be engaged in doing metal cladding of a clay stove, or for women to be involved in the industrialization processes in our countries? Is that an acceptable norm? Because for me, it's not acceptable. It's really not acceptable. So I'm wondering if people maybe can raise hands if they feel that it's acceptable that it would take 10 years, maybe 10 years or even less, for women to be engaged in the industrialization of our economies in developing countries. I don't know if that's going to raise any questions, but
no. I think also, I was present at the Vienna Energy Forum yesterday, and the clear the clear message from many of the discussions was that we have the technologies available, we need to scale them up, and this transition is only going to happen if the people in the countries concerned will really participate as active entrepreneurs, and as prosumers in this discussion in the form of cooperatives whatsoever. But I think what we all struggle with is the scale that we, and also the scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us. I was always thinking, 2030 is tomorrow. 2050 is in 32 years from now. So this is not, and the big question is, how can we bring it to scale, and how can we make it quicker? And I think the key on this is to get people on the ground involved in making it happen. I don't think it is acceptable, but I can also understand that it is quite difficult to really make it an inclusive transition. And I think if it would not be difficult, we would not be here on this stage debating about it. There are lots of concepts out there, but what we need to do is really, I think, take them to scale. Yes.
So I think we've established that there are youth involvement and women involvement have very different dynamics and different issues in there. So I know we've been going back and forth a little bit. And I wanted to raise the issue of, why should we bother involving youth? What is the need to do that? Hopefully we don't need to ask that question about women, because at least to this audience that should be pretty obvious. But with the youth, it's often less obvious. What is the reason for doing that? Now, one of those we did kind of mention is that it's kind of the future leadership and having people who can take over the leadership roles and really having it as a training process. But the other thing that I think is really important is the education element, that particularly with SDG 7, we are fighting against the status quo, and doing that involves kind of changing people's minds, changing the way that people are thinking. And to be honest, by engaging people, even when they're in high school, primary school, that is often a much easier way of doing that. Getting people to go home, engage their own families. So by engaging the general public through young people, I think is a way that we can be really successful about trying to have a wider impact on the status quo. I will say one of the other differences that we've been talking a lot about sub-Saharan Africa in some areas where perhaps the main issue is connecting people to electricity. In parts of the Caribbean, the issue is not that most people are connected. The electricity is just about 4 times the price that you pay here in Austria. So there are different dynamics that we need to think about in different places as well. And so I'm not sure how that would fit into sub-Saharan African context, but definitely in the Caribbean, the key is this education element and helping people to realize that part of the reason that we don't have more renewable energy is because certain people are making a lot of money with the way things are right now.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to mention once more the importance also of role models and women entrepreneurs in the energy sector as role models. And I think we should not forget how important that is. I'm super happy that we have a young women entrepreneur who is now running this energy cooperative umbrella group in Georgia. It's also a barrier. She's not as easily taken serious by the government and by the banks, etc. And we really need to have solidarity networks and support these type of women role models in the energy sector. And the same for youth. I think there are some really nice projects. I heard from one of the utilities in Europe that they also like intervention mechanisms, and they like setting aims with some quota and bringing in, for example, young people with an immigrant background or young women or people who are not naturally going to apply for a job in their company. But you can make it an aim of your company to try and want to have more diversity and more young people and more women with a diverse background. And so I think we know this works, and we should continue to promote this as part of company policies, voluntary, but maybe also as part of government policies to really do this, create these possibilities for young people and for women and for people with diverse backgrounds.
Can I ask you a quick question on that point? I think one of the issues that you highlighted there is that you said this young, powerful woman entrepreneur is not listened to. And something that I've come across when I'm engaging with local groups is they say, oh, well, you're a white foreign man. They're going to listen to you. And that's really frustrating for me because the local groups have been saying the same thing for several years. And then I go into a country and they say, oh, well, you go and have a chat to the minister. And I can get that meeting straight away and I can have that chat straight away. So how do we balance that, that unfortunate issue that people do listen to me more as a man or as a foreigner, with the reality of trying to get people heard who should be heard more. Does that make sense? Do you have
I just want to mention 2 studies that I just came across last week. One is a survey that was conducted as part of the Global Energy Talent Index. It's about 16,000 respondents, and it shows that nearly 2/3 of professionals would be interested actually to move to a job within the alternative energy sector, and they'll be willing to even take a cut of up to 45% in salary to move. So that's quite interesting, I think, both for youth and women. But the other thing is another interesting study by McKinsey called Millennials, Burden, Blessing, or Both. And I found it very interesting that young professionals from 120 companies, including actually 55 of the Fortune 500, across all kinds of industries, found that young employees, more than their older co-workers, value genuine blending of their work and personal lives. Flexibility is important for them, and for many young women and a growing number of men, the top priority is family-friendly policies at work. So I think there's something there also to be learned within young generations, and some that can be also integrated in our thinking about education or training or labor policies in general.
Thank you very much. There is an intervention here. Joy, if we can have the microphone to the gentleman there, and if I can ask you to be short, because unfortunately we are already close to our finishing deadline.
I was sitting at the back and waving, but you are not.
I didn't see you, I'm sorry. Can you introduce yourself and where you come from, please, sir?
My name is Dasta Mabrato. I'm from Ethiopia, but currently associated with Stellenbosch University in South Africa. To start with your comment briefly, I think that could be a case for the bureaucrats and the mid-level experts to listen more to the white guy talking to them, but not to the ordinary people. I've been working across Africa, and the ordinary people do not have that misconception. It is a matter of the substance, which is important for them. You have managed to provoke me. I was having a reservation when Karsten talked about that 10, 20 years line, because I don't believe that we should wait, and we need to wait for that long. It is a matter of, first of all, I would appreciate your initiative in terms of the Greening Africa, which is a paradigm shift in a major institution from the North, and it is very, very much appreciated. But the key here is the challenge we have today is lack of social innovation. It's not technological innovation. I mean, the technologies are out there. The knowledge are out there, both advanced and local knowledge. But we don't have sufficient social innovation that will allow us to effectively utilize the capacity we have within the local community. And this transition is very critical, but you need to have a modality for social innovation that is contextual and that would allow communities to utilize their potential. And I think the energy cooperative approach is critical in that. And women could be a key player in that. Microfinances in Africa are being driven by women. And as somebody mentioned yesterday, they are AAA creditors, women groups. So there is a lot that could be achieved, and we can fast track this process if we have the proper social innovation framework that is contextual and responsive to the specific reality we work in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for reminding us that it's not only about technology, but it's also about behavior and about the social dimension of this whole energy transition. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we had quite a diverse and interactive panel here. I definitely enjoyed moderating it. I would like to ask you for a round of applause for all the panelists, and then head back to Karina for the conclusion.
Thank you. I think that we've heard a number of concrete examples of how women and young people are serving as key agents of change, both in demanding solutions, but also in designing and benefiting from sustainable energy solutions. And in doing so in some innovative ways, including through song in some cases, to get their message through. But we also heard about the importance of challenging traditional assumptions about the roles of women and men and young people, of being aware of the potential implications of new technologies and policies being put into place. And of course, the need for improved access to finance for small-scale projects and the support of both women and young people in entrepreneurial activities, but also in working on other energy projects. I hope that you found these sessions useful today, and we invite you to engage with us, the panelists, and with UNIDO and GWNet, as you go back and then continue working on our common goal of working on affordable and clean access to energy for everyone. And on behalf of CTCN, I would like to say that if you are a representative of a community or an NGO or a research or university or a national government representative, please consider making a request for assistance with free technology, knowledge, matchmaking, and capacity building to us. We would be very happy to work with you on any types of energy projects. And you can learn more about the CTCN from our website, which is shown up here. And then I would just like to thank you all for participating with us today, and to please ask you to join me in thanking Christine and all of the panelists from this session and the one before for a great discussion. Thank you.